24 hours brought him to the foothills, and 2 more days carried him into the cut. In the middle of the afternoon, he drove his burro into Sierra Padre and paused at the head of the single street. He could have shouted with joy, for everything was in place. Everything was exactly as it had been when his father was there. He closed his eyes and winked hard. It was almost as if he were himself, Peter Raleigh, not Peter's son Ed. That shingle on the right announced the Wu Ling Laundry. The general merchandise sign was just as unreadable as it had been since Gary the Kid shot up the town. And the horses in front of the saloon were the very horses who had ridden through all his father's yarns since Ed's 5th year. Straight to the saloon went Ed Raleigh, and strode through the swinging doors. And then he stopped, as a man stops in mid-ring when a straight left whacks against the point of his chin. For behind the bar stood a big man with grizzled hair and a prodigious paunch. Ed Raleigh winked again and then stepped to the bar. "Are you Olaf Bjornson?" he asked. "Yep, that's me." Ed Raleigh closed his eyes and clung to the edge of the bar. He felt breathless. Olaf Bjornson. The same man, the same name. Now there was one discrepancy. The Olaf of his father's stories would have answered, "Ja, I been that Olaf." It was the son, then. But the rest of the room was the same. The stove in the center had 3 iron legs, as it ought to have had, and the 4th one was of wood, black as iron from age and much sooty droppings. The familiar cobwebs trailed across the ceiling of unfinished boards, and over to the side, a picture of the mighty Salvador spread-eagling his field, and doing a spread-eagle himself to accomplish the feat. And behind the bar, the resolute face of John L. Sullivan with an American flag draped around his waist, the Boston strong boy in his youth. It was all the same, down to the smooth, unvarnished surface of the bar. The same bar on which his father had rested his glass of red-eye in the glorious days of old. "What'll you have?" Olaf Bjornson was asking. Ed Raleigh turned his eyes to right and left. There were a half-dozen other men in the room. A fellow with a scar on his cheek and the sideways trick with his eyes. Surely that was Whitey, the gambler. And the old man with a solemn beard must be philosophic Dan Morgan, who could deliver with equal impromptu ease an election speech or a funeral service. They were all there. All. "Well, come to life, kid. You sleeping?" Come to life. This fellow's vocabulary was the one jarring note in the entire picture. "Red-eye," muttered Ed Raleigh and mopped his forehead. The bartender stepped back along the bar and picked up bottle and glass. Ed waited suspended. There it was. The glass came spinning down the bar and then rocked to a halt directly in front of him. If this were not the true Olaf Bjornson, it was surely his reincarnation. Olaf with a 20th century tongue. He poured his drink, raised it, and remembered to toss it off in a single gulp. Remembering again, he pushed the chaser scornfully away. A chaser for a fellow from the mines. "Pah! New to town, ain't you?" inquired Olaf, eyeing the untasted chaser. Ed watched him with incredulous disgust. According to his father, no questions were ever asked in Sierra Padre. A man talked of his own volition, or else the town waited to know him by his actions. "Kinda," he snapped. He turned to glance out the window, over a lordly prospect of rocks and mountains in calling distance, when the door swung wide and an unsteady figure stepped within them. He was a tall man between 50 and 60, and a generation of hard living had whitened his head and seamed his face, as weather in a million years have wrinkled the front of Bald Eagle Peak itself. He was dressed like a youngster who had lately struck gold, perfect from his new hat to the dark yellow of his Napatan boots. His years sat easily upon him. His step was elastic and quick. His eyes danced as he looked around the barroom, and his body was still as light and gaunt as the body of a youngster in his prime. His working days were far from over, But as he stood there, Ed Raleigh noted an unsteadiness about the fellow, which was not the unsteadiness of age. "It's old Martin," observed Olaf Bjornsson. "Yeah, he's starting aging." He's finishing, you mean?" nodded a bystander at the bar. "He's just about gone." Old Martin strode to the bar with fumbling steps and leaned his elbows upon it at the side of Ed. "Whiskey. Whiskey, lad." Olaf, turning for the bottle, winked broadly at the others, and a tide of anger swelled in the breast of Ed Raleigh. They were mocking the old man. He watched sternly with a bright eye. If this mockery went too far, there were ways of putting a period to it. He tightened his formidable right hand tentatively and loosened the grip again. The knowing grin in the meantime traveled up and down the bar. Martin raised his brimming glass. His hand was shaking the moment before, but now it was perfectly steady, rock-like, as the hand of a crack shot when he draws his bead. "Gents, look at what I got in my hand." "We see it, Jim. You was always able to keep more in a glass than anyone in town." "That's my reputation. Well, boys, this is the last drop of liquor I drink in Sierra Padre. I'm wishing y'all luck. Here's to you." He downed the glass and then turned a watery eye of sorrow on the others. "Are you swearing off?" The old man looked at him and then started. "You give me a touch, partner. But no, he wouldn't look like you by this time. No, lad, I ain't swearing off, but I'm leaving Sierra Padre." "Never coming back?" asked Ed kindly. "Where you going?" "To make the honor of Jim Martin claim. The honor of Jim Martin." The slight quaver grew more pronounced. From the corner of his eye, Ed watched the open grins of the others, and he set his teeth. "Someone been doing you dirt, partner?" As Ed spoke, his glance threatened the rest and wiped away their mirth. "It's had been did." Martin straightened. He struck the bar with his bony fist, and the glasses danced and jingled. "It has been did." "But where you going? Ain't there nobody to help you?" "Nobody. This here thing lies between me and my maker. Maybe under the stars I'll meet him and I'll shoot him like a dog and God'll understand." He looked about him, sighing. "Joe," he said to the men with a stately beard. "It ain't easy to leave all you boys, Joe." He approached the other and clasped his hand. "I know what's gonna happen to me. I know that after I've killed them, they'll get me. Yes, sir, I'll give myself up. After finishing him, there ain't nothing left for me in life. I'll die happy." Joe attempted to draw away, but Martin took it for a gesture of persuasion. "Don't try to talk me out of it, Joe. My mind's sawed on it like a rock. I'm going out and get me a gun, and then I'm going to go down and get that train. I got only half an hour to make that train. And I got to get me some decent clothes. I ain't going to face him looking like a bum. Joe, I got the money and I got the time, and he's as good as dead. But it hurts me, Joe, to leave you boys. It sure do. And to the end, I'll be thinking of you. Thinking." He choked and covered his face with a shaking hand. Ed Raleigh felt stinging tears in his eyes. "Before I go, I gotta break my vow and have one more drink. With you, Joe." The bartender, as if he read Martin's mind, was already opposite them with a bottle and 2 glasses. "Here's to a quick trip, Jim," said the stately man. He winked cruelly at Olaf. "Are you going to give him a chance to draw?" "Chance? Me? Him?" Martin finished his whiskey hurriedly and smote the bar, coughing. When he could speak again, he cried, "What chance did he give me? No, he played me a dog's trick, and I'm going to shoot him down like a dog and stamp in his face when he's dead. But even that won't bring her back to me. Ed Raleigh shuddered, for he saw sobs swell the throat of Martin, and he had never seen a grown man weep before. But old Jim mastered himself, even as his eyes grew dim. She's gone, young man. And here he whirled and pointed a gaunt arm at Raleigh. Beware of women. Like you'd be careful of a pizzin' mad dog. Just beware of them that sink your teeth in you. Here. He touched his heart and then struck it with his fist. A woman has made me all hollow in here. That's what she's done. His voice changed. It shook him like a leaf that trembles on a quaking aspen before the coming of the storm. It rumbled from his chest like distant thunder on the mountains. But the gent that's done me wrong is gonna die before the sun rises. He's gonna eat dirt and he's gonna die, and he's gonna watch me laughing while his eyes get dark. He struck the bar again with his fist. Olif, more whiskey. I gotta drink with this young gent. I gotta drink to his health, and I gotta break my vow about not drinking again in Sierra Padre. I gotta make sure he's been warned plenty. And when the glasses were poured, he raised his own brimming potion. Think of the whisper of a woman like it was the hiss of a snake. Think of her promises like they was spoke by a Mex, a yeller-hided Mexican gracer. Drink to me, lad, and tell me ye won't forget. I won't forget, promised Ed Raleigh, his eyes very wide. And they drank solemnly together. Now, boys, said Martin, turning to the others, I'm saying goodbye, and God bless you before I go on my last trail. I'm prospecting for death. He raised a forbidding hand, though no one moved to speak. Don't argufy, don't be persuading me. Nothing between heaven and the Rio Grande will stop me. And boys, if you got women folk to home, you bid 'em say a prayer for the soul of poor old Jim Martin when he's hanging on the gallows. He started for the door with long, wobbly strides, his body weaving. Good God, cried Ed Raleigh. Are you men going to let him go out and commit murder like this? He sprang after Jim Martin, caught his shoulder. Partner, no matter what you got agin that gent, you got to be thinking twice. You ain't spry enough to get away from a marshal after you pulled your gun. I mean, where you going? Down in yonder valley, lad. Now leave go of my shoulder. And what's the name of this man? Pete Raleigh. And he's gonna die before morning. Ed Raleigh's hand fell, as though paralyzed from the shoulder of the revenger. He gaped. He tried to speak. And before he could regain his self-control, Jim Martin had staggered sidelong through the swinging doors. When Raleigh came to life, half a dozen men blocked his way and drew him back. And what curdled his blood? They were laughing. Let me go, you fools! Let me go! Oh, there'll be some busted heads in here. I mean, let me go! He's heading down the valley to murder my old man. Hold on, urged the white-bearded man, wiping tears of pleasure from his eyes. Old Martin's been starting down the valley after your dad's hide for 25 years and more, and he's never got away from Sierra Padre more'n once. Ed Raleigh stopped struggling. The amusement of all the faces around him was too genuine for a bluff. What in the name of God does it all mean? Are you Pete Raleigh's boy? Queried the stately elder, stepping closer. By the Lord, I think you are. You have the look of Pete, as I remember him. Same dark, thin face. So you're Pete Raleigh's boy. I'm Patrick Swanson. Pat Swanson? Why, you're the sheriff. Well, not for 20 years. I see your dad ain't quite forgot me. Sheriff, it's sure great to meet you, but ain't there really no danger from old Martin? He sure talked like death and killing and gunplay. Didn't he, though? He's been talking like that off and on for these 25 years. Ever since your pa pulled his stakes out of Sierra Padre. But what did he mean about a woman? Dad was always straight as far as I know. Ah, he's talking about Bess Devine. My mother? The infernal old fool, Easy, lad. Ain't no harm in him. So Bess is your mother, huh? The last we seen of her, she was eloped with your pa. Ed Raleigh scratched his massive head, frowning. But what does Martin mean by this rotten talk? Oh, it's always this way. I'll tell you the yarn. Back there in the old days, when Sierra Padre was first booming, after gold was struck in the Bald Eagle, Bess Devine was the prettiest girl in town. For a mining camp, she was almost too pretty to be good. Mind you, I don't mean your ma wasn't the straightest, finest girl that ever stepped, but you take the finest kind of girl and you put her down in a gang of men without no competition to speak of, and she gets a lot of funny ways with her eyes. Speaking in general, Bess played tag with the whole camp. She could pick a man up with her eyes and make him drunk with a smile, and then she slipped away to the next man. There was considerable Irish in Bess, which they's some in me too. I understood, but there was a pile that didn't. When we give a dance, mostly the men was dancing with each other. We'd tie a red string around the arm of some of the gents, and they was the ladies, and the others danced with them. But Bess was an honest-to-God girl, and there was always a crowd around her. She could pick and choose from 100 always. And she did do her picking right enough. She had her favorites, and she danced with them, but she always give the ones that she left behind her best smile and her best look under the lashes of her eyes. Gives me a thrill yet to think about how Bess used to handle us. She always made the ones that she didn't dance with feel like she really wanted to dance with them more than anybody else in the room. But they just didn't happen to ask her first. She was the kind of girl, lad, that a man would just see once and then keep dreaming about for a year or so afterward. That's the kind of girl she was. I can see her yet drifting through the crowd, shaking hands with newcomers, smiling right and left, and sowing the seeds of hell-raising all around her. Her eyes were as blue as the sky, and her hair was as black as midnight. And there was a ripple like running water in her laugh that started at your head and wound up in a shiver at your feet. That was Bess Devine, your mother. Well, among the other suckers who couldn't read Bess's mind, along comes this Jim Martin. He'd seen her in the street and stopped and gaped at her like she was a fish out of water. And then he went to the dance and he'd seen her again. And somehow, I think there'd been a fight between Bess and your pa. Somehow Jim got the bid to take her home after the dance. And he was so proud he couldn't hardly see a step in front of him. The next day, he started off straight for the mountains. He had his outfit, and he was going to find gold. A couple of months later on, your pa ups one day and elopes with Bess, and goes away down into the valley. He had his stake, and the only thing that kept him here in Sierra Padre some weeks had been Bess. Well, about the next day, down comes Jim Martin out of the mountains, with 60 days' whiskers on his face and his saddlebags loaded with ore. Whiskers and all, he goes straight for the cabin of Bess, and learns from her pa that she's gone. And her pa didn't spare no words when he was talking about Pete Raleigh. I know because I was sort of lingering around and I heard. And what between old man Devine and young Jim Martin, it was the most out-cussin'est time I ever heard. After a while, Jim comes back to the saloon and starts drinking, and telling the boys that he was going down into the valley to catch that gent that run off with his girl. First, he allowed that he'd get fixed up. He was going to look his best when he went down there, because he wanted to kill your dad and then let Bess see what she'd missed by not taking Jim Martin. Then were the days when I packed a star inside my vest and a .44, old style, on my hip. and I hung around promiscuous, waiting to land on Martin before he left town. He cashed in his gold and was loaded with yeller boys. And he spent the whole day throwing money away. The saloon got a lot of it, and his hand got so shaky that he couldn't handle his razor. So he hired a gent to shave him and gave him a round $100 for the job. Then he went over to the store and he got the best they have in the line of clothes. And when he comes out of that store, he was about the slickest thing that we'd ever seen here in Sierra Padre. Next, he comes down the street and he buys himself a 6-shooter. It was a beauty. And in them days, it was a treat to watch Martin handle a gun. After he comes back here to Olaf's place, all lit up already, and starts saying goodbye to the boys. It took him a long time because all the boys was fond of Pete Raleigh, and they tried to persuade Jim to stay quiet. But Jim Martin kept right on, and every time he said goodbye, he said it was the last drop of liquor that would pass down his gullet until he dropped Pete Raleigh in the dirt and stepped on his face. But every time he'd see some other friend of his and have to have just one more drink. Every time he had another drink, he'd set him up for the house and didn't ask for no change. Taking it all around, it was a pretty fair paying afternoon for Olaf's place, and Jim's money kept going like water. Pretty soon down the street, he heard the train whistle, and that was the train that Jim wanted to catch to get down to the valley. So he lets out a holler for the engineer to stop for him, like he could have been heard, and starts running. But he was so overbalanced with red-eye that when he got outside the door, he doubled up on the steps, put his head on the floor, and went to sleep, peaceful as a kid. The train pulled out, and Jim Martin wasn't in the coaches. The next morning, he woke up broke. Somebody rolled him for his wad what he hadn't spent. All he had was his fine clothes and his gun. Well, he wasn't going to be able to walk down in them boots, a 3-day trip. Besides, his clothes was sort of messed up from lying on the steps of the saloon. And he wasn't going to go down and do that killing without being able to show himself all dressed up, fit to kill, to Bess afterward. The end was Jim Martin traded his gun and clothes in, and borrowed a stake and started out prospecting again. It was 2 years pretty near before he come back, and then he come back with a nice lot of stuff and cashed it in proper. We'd all forgot about Bess and Pete by that time, but Jim Martin hadn't. He'd been off there in the hills swinging a pick and cursing Pete in time with the swing of it. He started right in on the same program. He was just burning up with hate for Pete. It was sort of a consuming fire in him, like the Sky Pilot says. He began spending money real liberal. He bought fine clothes again, got himself a gun. And then he bought him a ticket for the valley. I wasn't the sheriff no more then, so it wasn't no trouble of mine. Besides, I didn't have no hankering to mix things with him without it being my own fight. I just sat back on my haunches with the rest of the boys, and Jim kept on swearing that not another drop of red-eye would flow down his throat. And then having another drink and getting real sad, weeping over the boys because he was never going to see them again. We began making bets about whether he'd get too drunk to get to the train when it come in. But the boys that bet against him lost their money. He just lasted to the train and got inside and done a flop in the seat. There was considerable excitement, and the boys sent for the sheriff. But before he got there, the morning train come through the next day. And off it stepped Jim Martin, billin' mad. After a while, we found out what happened. Before his train got to the station down in the valley, Jim was sleeping, sweet and soft and peaceful, with his head on the arm of his seat. When he got to the station, the conductor threw him off and left him on the platform. That was late in the evening, and there was nobody just then in the station house. When the station agent come out in the early morning, he'd seen Jim Martin still lying on the platform, smiling in his sleep like a newborn baby. And he just naturally figured that Jim had come to the station to get the train and had been too drunk to quite make it. He'd seen how much money there was in Jim's pocket, and it was just enough to take him up the line to Sierra Padre. Believe he kept Jim's gun for a souvenir. The agent got him a ticket, took the money, and put Jim Martin aboard the first train to the cut. Jim come to on the way, and after a while, it sort of soaked in on him that he was traveling towards the mountains when he should have been traveling away from them. He wanted the train stopped, but the conductor wouldn't do it. Then Jim was going to kill the conductor, and a lot of the gents on the train draped themselves over Jim to keep him quiet. They wasn't too gentle, and when they got through with him, Jim looked like he'd been fighting a mountain lion. He was that tore up. Well, for a couple of days he went stomping around town, cussing his luck. And then he settled down when he couldn't bum no more drinks off an Olaf. He got another steak and he hiked for the hills again. And that's been going on ever since. This makes about the 6th time he's come down to town. Every time he goes back up to the hills and works away in the mines. Then when he has a little steak, he takes it and goes off prospecting by himself. Usually he makes some sort of a strike and stays with it until he gets out the easy pay. Then he comes down here cursing Pete Raleigh and making lectures about what women ought to be and what they are. He always starts drinking. He always starts throwing his money away, because ain't nobody more generous than old Jim Martin. But after that second time, he ain't never got as far as buying his gun. The door opened. Peter Raleigh stood in the entrance. He was a very big man by nature, but with the light behind him, he looked to his son like some biblical giant. That shaggy beard, which was the despair of Mrs. Raleigh, now flared out a little on either side, clotted with the dust and sweat of long riding, so that he looked as if a strong wind were still blowing against his face. His coming made a little pause through the barroom. When he thudded heavily across the room, all eyes jerked after him, stride by stride. He came to a pause before his son. "Well, my fine young snapper," he roared, "what in hell might be the meaning of this?" His voice was made for the open. It raged and echoed through even the big bar. Ed Raleigh screwed up his courage and tried to match that volume. "I'm starting for myself." "You are, I sure am. You're gonna loot the mountains, maybe, and come back with $1 million inside of a year, huh? You young fool. I tell you, you're gonna hit the trail home with me." As a rule, he had his way with his family, and he would have had his way again had they been alone. But it seemed to Ed Raleigh, staring miserably past the shoulder of his father, that he surprised a meager inward smile just twitching at the lips of Olaf the bartender. It maddened him. Where you start ain't my worry. You go down into the valley, or keep on into the hills, I won't stop you. No more will you stop me where I want to go. There was a certain acid in the cool tone of this announcement that shocked Peter Raleigh back to good judgment. His wife had the same quality of voice when she was driven into a corner on some subject near to her heart. "Don't you be saying things you'll be sorry for later on, Eddie. You and me are going to walk outside and talk things over. Come along." But once more Ed Raleigh saw a smile pass between Olaf and one of the others, and he grew hot to his hat brim. "What you've got to say, you can say right here. This was a good enough place for you to start talking, and it's good enough for you to finish in. I can stand it if you can." Anger always made Peter Raleigh half-devil. He stood swaying with sudden passion. "Now, by God, you hear me, young gent. You start for that door, or from this minute you ain't no..." The door swung wide, a gust of voices rolled in from the porch, and then the loud tones of Martin. "Come on in, boys, and have a drink. You'll need liquor before you come to the end of this here story, 'cause it's sad and ornery." He came first, a trifle unsteady, and behind him were several who obviously had just come down from the mines. "Dad," whispered Ed Raleigh, the color rushing from his face. "For God's sake, make your getaway. This is Martin, and he's looking for you with a gun." "Martin." Big Raleigh wavered, and then shrugged back his shoulders. I've never sneaked away from any man, and I ain't gonna begin now. And yet, knowing this was irrevocable, stepped back and prepared for the fight. Are you still planning for that train? Said Olaf to Martin. And I'm gonna get it. Olaf, I want you to know my friend, Bud Hendricks. He waved forward a huge black-bearded man. Bud is guaranteed to get me to that train. He turned. Step up, boys, all of you. My dust ain't run out yet by a hell of a long ways. Here his eye fell upon Big Raleigh. He halted, and then walked straight across the room and paused a pace away from Peter. With his hand on his gun, Ed waited for the lightning move, the flash of steel, and in his heart, he had never admired his father as he did at this moment. For the big man did not stir a hand. He waited for the other to make the decisive move. Stranger, you might as well know what's coming off. Come and liquor up and hear a story what every man ought to know. He waved towards the bar, and Pete Raleigh, after an instant of hesitation, smiled quietly and followed. As for Ed, he was ready for the trouble he thought must come. Got your eye on the time, Bud? Asked Martin. The other exposed a huge gold watch. I'm watching every minute. If what you say is right, that gent ought to die, and I'll help you on your way. If I'm right, roared Martin. Don't the whole town know how Pete Raleigh done me dirt and sneaked away with my girl, married her? By his side, Pete Raleigh straightened. For a moment, Ed thought that the denouement was about to come. And then he saw his father relax and watch Martin with an odd smile. For 20 years, I've been hungering to get at him. For 20 years, I've been burning up with a fire to see this gent face to face. And now the time has come. Ed Raleigh shuddered, but his father had not stirred. He still stood there at the side of Martin, looking at the avenger with a quiet, reminiscent smile. Everyone had taken his drink, and it was Pete Raleigh who proposed the toast. Martin, here's hoping that you meet Pete Raleigh face to face, as close as I'm standing to you now. Ah, stranger, he went on, laying a hand on Raleigh's arm. I like you. You got a straight look about your eyes. Well, so long. I gotta go down and kill Pete Raleigh. This is my last try, and if I don't get him this time in the valley, I'm gonna call the deal off. When I come back, partner, I'm gonna see more of you. Thanks, said Pete Raleigh. Go get him. Time up, barked Bud Hendricks. Wait a minute, I got a gent here that can understand, and I want him to know. Don't you hear the train whistling? Asked Bud Hendricks. Damn the train, partner. But Bud Hendricks was a man of his word. Far away the train hooted around the bend, and Bud, fixing one brawny arm under the shoulder of Martin, caught him with the other hand on the opposite side and fairly lifted him toward the door. When he's dead and buried, shouted Martin over his shoulder, I'll come back and see you again, stranger. Pete Raleigh waved his thanks. Set 'em up, Olaf, called Martin as he was borne through the door. Set 'em up for all the boys, and I'll pay when I get back from making Mrs. Raleigh a widow. It was some time later that Peter Raleigh remembered the mission which had brought him to Sierra Padre. And when he turned, his son was not in the saloon. He went hurriedly into the street and peered up and down, but there was still no sign of Ed Raleigh. For far up the side of Bald Eagle Peak, steering his course through the ears of his burro, Ed Raleigh was voyaging into the old land of his father. In the meantime, notwithstanding the assistance of Bud Hendricks and his gold watch, Jim Martin again missed the train.
End of side 2.